We are in El Paso, Texas, obviously in the southwestern part of the United States. We are at Rosa's Cantina, the famous Rosa's Cantina. And the part of El Paso that we're in is actually called Smelter Town. That's what it was traditionally called because of the various smelters and so forth in the area. We are probably about 5 miles from the Mexican-American border. We are actually across the street from New Mexico. We are, of course, in Texas right now. Rosa's Cantina was originally founded as Los Tigres bar in the 1940s sometime. In 1957, it was bought by Beto Zubia. One of the first things he did when he bought it was change the name to Rosa's Cantina. Now, nobody's quite sure why he changed the name. The rumor is that there was a waitress by the name of Rosa that worked here, and he thought it had a good ring to it. There are other rumors as well about why he might have changed it. But the change was, it was a historic change. I think it was probably the best way to put it. Changed it in 1957, and it was really a neighborhood and a locals place for Smelter Town, and that was about it. It was a small cafe with a bar that served the locals. But then in 1959, at some point in 1959, Marty Robbins was traveling back from Nashville, Tennessee, on his way to Phoenix, Arizona. And legend is that he stopped right outside of Rosa's on that road trip. This is Donovan Drive right in front of us here, and this was originally the highway that led through El Paso that would take you into New Mexico, and then he would go his way into Phoenix. This would actually take you all the way up to Albuquerque at the time. So he stopped there, got out of the car, stretched his legs, looked at the sign, looked through the windows. He looked across the street to New Mexico. In October of 1959, he released a song called El Paso. It went to the top of the charts, and in that song is featured, one of the main characters is actually a bar that he calls Rosa's Cantina, and it's where essentially the entire story takes place.
Down in West Texas, town of El Paso, I fell in love with a Mexican girl. That's about as much of it as I know. And I'm probably way off on that too.
It's not on the jukebox.
Yeah. It feels like that should be on the jukebox right now.
That put this place on the map. All of a sudden, the small Rosa's Cantina, that was a small neighborhood bar, locals joint, was suddenly famous. And now it's still famous. It's known worldwide as the Rosa's Cantina in El Paso, Texas. In 2011, my best friend and I got the great idea to kind of take a road trip across America. And on that road trip, what we wanted to do was not hit the historic baseball parks, which has already been done. We wanted to hit the historic bars of America. And the reason why, I think that the real true classic and historic bars of America tell more about our history than just about any other place that you can think of. Hemingway once said, "Don't bother with the churches or the government buildings or the city squares. If you want to learn about a culture, spend a night in its bars." And I think that certainly it was fitting for Hemingway because that's what he famously did. But it's true. If you go to a place like this, when you visit El Paso, Texas, you can go to the various museums and so forth that will tell you the history of El Paso, or you can come to a place like this that's lived the history, that's still here. The people that could tell you stories about how El Paso evolved and changed over the years, they still come here and eat and have a drink, and you can talk to them at the bar. So that was our purpose, is we really wanted to get a sense of America's history through these bars. And so we wrote a book that was released in 2013 called Bucket List Bars. And it has the history of a lot of our famous bars, the founding of them, the kind of the famous anecdotes and narratives that they saw throughout the years. We went from Newport, Rhode Island, and stopped in San Francisco, California. So, and we passed through this area, and Rosa's was one that we really wanted to make sure and hit. We wanted to tell its story because it's such a wonderful story. And I think the humility of the place means that it kind of deserves to have its story told by somebody else, even if it doesn't want to tell it itself.
I think it's a historical marker because of the song. You know, down in the West Texas town, nobody would have ever thought that this place has been around so long. And the atmosphere, again, when you come in, most of the time you come in, the jukebox playing either Sun City or the El Paso song, you know, Marty Robbins. And it's just all types of people come in here, from business people to bikers, and everybody gets along, and it's great.
One of the reasons we wanted to do this was because bars do have a stigma about them. A lot of people think, oh, it's just a bar, people will go there and drink and get drunk and so on and so forth, but the history that you find in bars is different. Let's take, for example, the fact that one of the oldest bars in America is in a small town actually, north of New York City called Tapan, New York. There's a bar there called the Old 76 House that was built in 1886 by Dutch immigrants. Okay, you can go into this bar and have a beer there. George Washington, for sure, was in this bar at a certain time. And the reason I bring up this analogy is because you could go to George Washington's home. You can go to Mount Vernon, and you could see where George Washington, for example, wrote his letter at his desk and ate his meals at his dinner table. But you're seeing all this from behind velvet ropes. You know, you're paying an admission and you're going in and seeing all this from afar. You're looking into it, looking at these artifacts of history. If you were to go to the Old 76 House, you can stand in the exact same place that George Washington stood and have a drink where George Washington drank. These places are still used for the identical purposes as they were when they were founded. Now you take Rosa's Cantina. El Paso, Texas was a Wild West city when it was founded and up through the 50s and 60s. So when this place was built, can you imagine the kind of stories that this place could tell? Because it saw and understand that people were still wearing cowboy hats and still wearing boots and still dusty from outside back in the 40s and 50s when this place was founded. So it was everything that Marty Robbins said it was, even when he wrote that song. So just imagine the kind of stories that this place could tell. But again, you're not experiencing this history from behind glass. You know, you're not looking at it as an artifact that you can't touch, you can't handle.
It's that good.
You can walk in here and eat the food that they've been serving for
Oh, the beans are delicious.
7 decades almost. You can sit at the same bar that has been here for 7 decades and almost share that experience and share the history of the people that were doing that in the 1940s. And I think there other than churches, which is a completely different experience, there are very few institutions where you can still have that kind of experiential history that you have in a bar. So one of our goals was to try to remove that stigma from a lot of these places. There's a place in New York City right now called Chumley's. Chumley's was founded in the 1920s as a speakeasy, and it's more famous authors passed through it. Authors have an attraction to bars anyway, I think, but it's more famous authors passed through it than really any other place standing in New York City, including the library. Well, Chumley's had to close down temporarily to be rebuilt after one of the walls caved in. The wall caved in, it was rebuilt, but all of a sudden the neighborhood didn't want it there anymore. It said they didn't want this disturbance, they didn't want this bar, and the owner, who's a firefighter, has been, I think, fighting since about 2006 to reopen this historic and classic bar. But unfortunately, because it's a bar, it has the stigma of it just has a bad reputation, and the neighbors don't want it there anymore. But in fact, I think the place like Chumley probably increases the value of that neighborhood tenfold. If you take Chumley's out, it's just another neighborhood in Manhattan. With Chumley there, you have a story, and you have a fabric of history that you don't find anywhere else in Manhattan because they've been shutting down. Let's go back a ways. Trade unions were founded in a bar, for example, in bars rather. Now, why did they form trade unions in bars? Well, where did the working class go after work, after a hard day's work? Especially if we're talking the late 1800s, early 1900s, they would go to a bar to relax, and they started talking while they were relaxing. And you know what? The boss shouldn't treat us this way, and we shouldn't be working 12 hours a day. You know, we shouldn't be working 6 days a week and only get 1 day off, and the conditions where we work are just not safe. You know, people are dying at our factory and so forth. So trade unions started. So those are the types of things that people talk about. People talk about conspiracy. The Boston Tea Party was planned in a bar in Boston called the Green Dragon Tavern. That was also where that's also where Paul Revere actually started his famous midnight ride, was in that bar. So you have conspiracies that take place in bars. Music. Bob Dylan started in a small bar in Greenwich Village. You know, poetry. Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac. When On the Road is all about him going from bar to bar to bar to bar. And if you go to Denver, you can still find two of the bars that he frequented while he was staying there. So obviously you have some very kind of far-reaching famous discussions. Every day though, people come into this bar from the places that are the workplaces that are local. They come here and they relax and they have a beer or they have dinner, and they talk about, you know, life. I mean, those are the types of discussions that happen. That's why I say, you know, I think other than bars, the only other place that has this type of experiential history is a church. But you have different types of discussions happening in churches, and so if you were to come here to Rosa's Cantina and you've never been here before, you sit at the bar and you order a beer and you talk to the person next to you. Chances are this person will tell you a lot more about El Paso, Texas than you will ever get out of a history book or out of a museum or out of any other city buildings that Hemingway mentioned. We are in La Mesa, New Mexico. It's an old farming town in far south New Mexico, not far from the Texas border. Chopi's Bar the building that we're in was built in about 1940, but the history stretches pretty far back. About 1915, Chopi Benavides' mother started selling red enchilada plates to the local farmers. Now, because she had arthritis, she couldn't have a dedicated restaurant. So whenever she had some food ready and was able to sell it, she put a lantern on outside of the restaurant, and people would know that they can come and buy her food. Well, about 1920, obviously Prohibition hit, and the restaurant still wasn't a formal restaurant. However, we know for a fact from Chopi's daughter, who told us that her grandmother was moonshining and making drinks for the locals, because obviously they couldn't get it anywhere else. Well, after Prohibition, 1933, they opened the restaurant and the bar formally. Now the bar used to be, so we're looking at about 1933, 1934 is about when the bar appeared. Now the bar originally was in the house next door to us, which is where the Chopi's restaurant is, and it took up the front largest part of the building. As a matter of fact, it just had the bar, and they'd sell the food from the bar. However, Chopi was a bit concerned because his daughter's bedroom was on the other side of the wall from the bar. So he started worrying about what his daughters were hearing at night as people would come in and patronize the bar. So with that in mind, in the early 1940s, he built this original building. It's about 30 feet away from the original building. He felt that would be far enough removed from his daughters and from their bedrooms, so they wouldn't have any of the influence. And it's been around since then. Chopi's is an absolutely beloved icon in this area. At any given time, you'll come in here, you'll sit down at the bar, and probably the best part about this particular place is just the diverse crowd that you get. You could have the mayor of El Paso or Las Cruces on one side of you, and a farm worker on the other side, and they're getting along. All of you are getting along just fine. You're sitting at the bar and enjoying a cold drink and relaxing. And that was the thing that made Chopi's such a wonderful place, is it's so comfortable. It's small. There's not a lot of pretense here, as you can see. There's nothing really fancy on the wall. Mr. Benavides, Chopi Benavides himself, became a very beloved figure in the area. Bars generally get a bad rap, and bar owners get a bad rap. But if you look around, you'll see all the trophies and all the pictures and all the plaques that are dedicated to Chopi Benavides. And these are I think these are monuments to what he was in the community. He sponsored all of these teams. He sponsored charity events all the time. He was always giving them himself. So not only did his reputation, obviously, in standing in the community grow, but so did his place. And it's one of these. It's almost a ritual for a lot of people when they come to the Las Cruces area. If they have any friends or family that live here, they say, "You've got to go to Chopi's. Let's go." And they'll bring him out here for a drink and for maybe one of their famous rellenos or something like that. As far as the ranking, it's hard to rank any of them. I would say it's simply one of the more important places in the area. Mesilla, New Mexico in the mid to late 1800s was actually the largest small town between San Antonio and Tucson. It was a major stop in the stagecoach. The Gadsden Purchase, or the Gadsden Treaty, was signed not too far from where we're standing right now. And here, the nice thing about Mesilla is not only the history and kind of the quaint charm, obviously the culture, but there are three very nice old historic bars. The building that houses El Patio has been there since at least the mid to late 1800s. Colonel A.J. Fountain, who was a Union soldier, a colonel in the Union Army during the Civil War, decided to settle here. He was from San Francisco, from the San Francisco area originally. Decided to settle here, and he became a lawyer and an attorney in the largest town at the time, which was where we're standing, Mesilla. And the building that houses El Patio was his building, and that's where he had both his printing press, or his newspaper, as well as his law office. And then when he died in tragic circumstances, he and his young son, his 8-year-old son, they had just attended a trial in Lincoln, New Mexico, and it was for the prosecution rather of a cattle rustler. After the trial, Colonel Fountain and his young son loaded up their horse and buggy, and they were about to make the long trip back here to Mesilla, to their home, and they were never seen again. All that was found actually in the White Sands, the dunes of White Sands, were 2 pools of blood, some shell casings, the horses and the buggy. The bodies were never found, so the desert just kind of swallowed them up. Well, after he passed away, obviously his building, his property passed on to his son. Then from him it got passed on to his son, A.J. Fountain III. Well, that one was a student at New Mexico A&M, and he wanted to be an engineer, but unfortunately his professors said, because of your Hispanic lineage, you'll probably never find work. Now this is in 1933, 1934. He took his professor's advice, unfortunately, fortunately, and he took the old building that his family had always owned, and he opened El Patio Cantina. So it's kind of a staple. It's been passed down to his son, A.J. Fountain the fourth, and he will be passing it on to his son, obviously.
Right here, this is a photograph of old Mesilla, probably in the 1880s or 90s. And this is where our bar is. The same door, the same opening. This is Mesilla. That's the way Mesilla looked. And I kind of missed, I miss old Mesilla back in before it became discovered.
You know, there are a lot of different types of bars, right? There are tiki bars, and there are saloons. There are probably cowboy bars, there are biker bars, and there are dive bars. I think El Patio is probably best described as a dive bar. In fact, at one time, Men's Journal called them one of the top 10 dive bars in the United States. A dive bar is old, has a lot of character. There's typically taxidermy hanging on the walls somewhere. The tables are mismatched, but you know, nobody really cares about that stuff. This isn't a place that's trying to be over the top. They've never heard of something called mixology, right? That's just something that doesn't exist there. They have cheap drinks. They have a very warm and inviting atmosphere. They have friendly locals and friendly people. And that's it. There's not a lot of pretense. You know, dive bars, a place like El Patio, dive bar like that, it kind of becomes. You can't really recreate or make that feel that they have when you walk into them. It's a little bit dark, a little bit mysterious, but it's still welcoming at the same time. And that's what a place like El Patio is. We are in La Posta de Mesilla, in, of course, the town of Mesilla, New Mexico. La Posta, the compound is very old. The building itself, the structure that you see around you, is from at least the mid-1800s. It has been built on over the years and expanded quite a bit, but this is going to be one of the major compounds of the Mesilla Plaza here. In the late 1800s, well, mid to late 1800s, right outside of the window here, it was used as a stagecoach stop, and the room that we were in was known as the Corn Exchange Hotel, and there's a cantina right next to us, and that was the Corn Exchange Cantina, of course. At the time, this was actually a very, very nice hotel. They served a wide variety of foods, had amazing variety of drinks, and a lot of notables came through here. We know that President Grant, for example, stayed here twice when he was president, and according to the log, he never paid for either time, which I guess if you're president is okay. Pancho Villa, we know, stayed here. Kit Carson came through here. The compound itself basically encompassed everything that you would need to run a stagecoach line, if you think about it, right? As a stagecoach was coming in, the horses would have to be stabled and shoed, and that's where the blacksmith came in. Parts of the saddle and the reins and so forth probably had to be repaired, and so they had the leathersmith next to them. There's again a bunkhouse, and there's rooms for the guests to sleep as well. So the compound itself pretty much covered everything that you would need to run a successful stagecoach, and that's why this was actually a stop on the Butterfield stage line in the late 1800s. The Butterfield stage was the first transcontinental stagecoach line that ran from Illinois all the way to California, and it ran right through here, came right through El Paso and up into here. So there's a lot of history here, and it's certainly a don't miss place. We're fairly certain that Billy the Kid would have come here as well. We know that because right across the street is the jail and courthouse, and this was a stagecoach stop, and of course he was under armed guard, and he wouldn't have been riding a horse when he came, so he would have come through a stagecoach. The restaurant, La Posta de Mesilla, was opened in 1939 by Katie Griggs Comunes, who bought it from her uncle for, according to the deed, $1 and love and affection. That's what she bought it for. The room that we're in is the original room of La Posta. In other words, this is all that La Posta was back in 1939 when she opened it. She didn't have she had dirt floors, or weren't brick floors at the time. She had no running water. She only had a few tables, and her mother was actually cooking right in the back there. Her first day of opening, she ran out of food. She swore that'd never happen again. Palacio Bar was opened in about 1934 as well, and it has a little bit of a different history. Pablo Salcido and his father were blacksmiths. And in the 1930s, they obviously had a blacksmith shop where the place is located now. They expanded the shop, built a large shop. Pablo got married, and his wife had the great idea to, let's host a dance this Saturday, invite the locals to the dance. So they did, and it was a roaring success. And after a while, they said, we're making more money off charging admission to these dances than you are as a blacksmith. And so they took the next step, and he retired from being a blacksmith, and they turned it into a dance hall and a bar. Eventually the dance hall went away and it just became a bar, and so Palacio Bar has been around since 1934. Now the really interesting thing about Palacio is it's quite what we'll call old school. Many bars had a general rule that either women had to drink somewhere else or women had to enter through another entrance or something like that. Some bars were just for men. Women weren't allowed. Palacio Bar was one of those bars where women were not allowed. Now here's the very interesting part about that. In 1970, the National Organization for Women sued McSorley's Old Ale House in New York City. McSorley's Old Ale House is one of the most famous old historic classic bars in the U.S., by far. And they had a men-only policy up until 1970. In fact, one of the owners was a woman, and she could not enter her own bar until Sunday when they had closed. So it was a very famous case. Went all the way to the Supreme Court, and McSorley lost, of course, and it was open to women. However, Palacio didn't allow women into the bar until 1991, and that's actually when Pablo passed away. And then the bar was inherited by his daughter, obviously, is a woman, and the main bartender is now a woman. So it's changed quite a bit. But I think it just kind of illustrates the point how culturally different we are from a lot of different parts in the world.
Well, way back when it was modern days, but in old Mesilla, it still wasn't quite here yet. Well, things have changed quite a bit since then. I imagine that they had different perspectives on things, that women shouldn't be in bars and men should only be in bars, but we've come a long way, and now men and women frequent bars equally. I live here, and years ago, my father used to come here on a regular basis, and now as my dad has grown older, he doesn't frequent the bars anymore. Now I do, and he hasn't been in a bar in a long time, so it's very different for him to understand that I come here now and it's okay. So I try and let him understand that it's okay that I can come here now. But it's very hard for him to understand that because he grew up in a different time period.
I want people to understand that bars are not simply places where people go to get drunk and raise problems or chaos or whatever. I want people to understand that these old bars have history to them, that they are part of our history. If you go to a museum, you can read about it, but you can't experience it. So whether people go to these places or not, I want them to appreciate the history behind these places. I certainly want them to go to these places. These places really, they depend on people finding them. Just understand that these places, there's a lot more to these places than people might think.